Hello. The Warhammer Fantasy world has evolved and changed a great deal over the years, and much of its lore has been informed by Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. But despite that game being a true classic and still in print, it's not had the smoothest sailing through the RPG market throughout the years. My guest today founded a company in the mid-90s, Hogshead Publishing, to make sure that WFRP remained alive. And whilst he was at it, he changed the UK RPG market forever. By the early 2000s, though, despite the success of that company, he chose to shut it down. We talk about why, his journey through the RPG world, creating some of the most innovative and award-winning storytelling role-playing games ever, and what it's like to work on Warhammer. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today I'm in conversation with James Wallis. James, thank you for joining me. I thought it might be a good place to start with a little bit about how you ended up in the role-playing game industry at all. Sort of what was your journey into RPGs to start with?
Oh, I think like a lot of us in the 80s, I discovered RPGs at school. I was at boarding school. I did not have a good time at boarding school. I really hated it, but I discovered Dungeons and Dragons, and it quite possibly saved my life. It gave me an outlet. It gave me a social set. It gave me something to do and somewhere to go mentally that was not this horrible oppressive environment. And not long after discovering RPGs, I discovered RPG fanzines. My local shop, the family lived in Ipswich. There was a lovely little shop called Orwell Games, and they had a few early role-playing games fanzines. This is 82 or 83. And I looked at these things and went, what, you can just write stuff and photocopy it and sell it? Wow. So I started doing that. Did a fanzine while I was still at school, screwed up my A-levels as a result. Did another one when I came down to London, where I still am, to study for my degree. Started another one there and started getting approached. There was a bit of a boom. This is 85 now. There were a couple of independent magazines starting out, including one called Adventurer, and they wrote to me and said, would you write for us? It's like, what, you can get paid for this as well? So I wrote for Warlock magazine, which was the fighting fantasy magazine. I wrote for Adventurer. I wrote for White Dwarf. Paid my bar bills through college doing that. And then, where we got to? 89, I left, went off around the world for a belated gap year. Ended up at Gen Con, where I had, because I'd been corresponding with American games designers, hadn't done any work for them. But one of my friends introduced me to Kevin Simbida of Palladium Books, who said, oh, England, we're doing a book set in England, and the writer's just dropped off it. Do you want it? And that writer was the sadly recently deceased Janelle Jacques. And the book was Mutants in Avalon, which is basically it's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but there's been a disaster. It's the After the Bomb series, so it's post-apocalypse, but it's England. So if you're American and England and post-apocalypse, what else do you throw in the mix? King Arthur, of course. So that was basically the whole of my brief. And I wrote that. And I did another book for Palladium, and then I and a couple of friends who'd been working on a card game sold that to Atlas, which is there's a game called Once Upon a Time, which has been in print continuously almost since 1993. And that just kind of I seem to have become a games professional by accident. I'd never intended to start working full-time in the games industry, but at the same time, I'd never really been sure what else I was going to do. I'd kind of belatedly trained as a journalist and was writing for people like the UK Press Gazette, which is the magazine about the UK press industry. So it's a magazine about magazines and newspapers. A theme that kind of recurs through my career is going for the meta, is doing stuff about stuff rather than the stuff itself. So that was kind of how I found my way in. And I wasn't actually full-time. I did quite a lot of that, but I was also writing books for Puffin, books for Virgin, doing a lot of copy editing. I was being a freelance journalist. And then Andrew Rilston, who was one of my co-designers on Once Upon a Time, and I set up a quasi-academic journal of role-playing and storytelling systems, which initially we called Interaction, and then were told by a sharp lawyer's letter that the title was already taken by Sierra Online, so we changed it to Interactive Fantasy. And this was a quasi-academic journal about interactive storytelling, basically, because this is 1994. Nobody else was looking at this stuff seriously, and we did 4 issues of that, which are still highly regarded. It's a free download off the net. You can download it off DriveThruRPG for nothing these days. But it's still quoted in people's PhDs and stuff. We lost money on every issue because this is 1994. We knew there was an audience out there, but there was no route to get to them, because at the time, the role-playing industry, there were online sales in 1994. Literally, 1994, you could not pay for stuff on the internet. The systems did not exist. They had not been built yet. Amazon didn't exist. PDFs didn't exist, or only barely. Some genius at Adobe had gone, if we wrap PostScript in a thing, we could call it a PDF. And the world was still going, not sure about this at that point, let alone, we could sell these. So you had to go through what was called the 3-tier system, which still exists, which is publishers sell to distributors, distributors sell to retailers, retailers sell to end customers. And trying to convince distributors and retailers that they should stock a quasi-academic journal about role-playing games was a no-no. That just did not happen. So we lost money on every issue. I'm still intensely proud of it. We had some fantastic people write for us. It was great fun. It opened a lot of doors for us. But anyway, so that was kind of where I was at the moment Hogshead was almost sort of born.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like it might have been ahead of its time then.
I think it very much was. I mean, those journals, there are journals like that these days, which, run and prosper. There are academics, there are people doing PhDs in the subject and learned books on it, some of which I've written for. But yes, 94, it was a subject we were passionate about. We were very, very interested in it. Once Upon a Time, our card game is a storytelling card game. It's about, but it's a competitive game at the same time. You all tell the same story by playing cards, but the person who can get to the point where they can finish it first is the winner. And no one was really looking at this stuff and talking about whether the narrative comes first or the game comes first and how they interact and all of that. So we had a lot of fun. We talked to some really interesting people. Greg Kostikian wrote a brilliant essay for us called I Have No Words and I Must Design, which is still on required reading on some university games courses these days. Greg Stafford we interviewed. Who else? Alan Varney, most of the UK crew, people like Phil Masters, loads and loads of good people.
Was there ever a definitive answer to what comes first, whether it's the narrative or the game?
Depends on the game. Depends on what you're looking for. But it's looking at different ones. Narrative-led games. Games that so many games out there that kind of use background and story almost as an excuse. To just lend color to slightly tedious or very mechanical. Mathematical formula. Ryan Knizia's games, have a thin layer of theme on top of really intricate, crunchy, interesting mechanics. But the whole area has exploded. But at the time, it was us and a chap called Chris Crawford in the States, who I had a couple of meetings with, who did it was a fanzine basically called Interactive Entertainment Design. But he was more about games design rather than narrative games design. So perhaps we should have gone broader. But no, it was just, you're quite right. It was ahead of its time because there was no route to get it to the people who wanted to read to it, who wanted to read it.
So that time then, so that puts you in 1994, and that was when you then founded Hogshead and started publishing Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Brought the first edition back to life. So how did that come about? How did you end up creating this company with that intention?
Okay, so we've got this magazine which appeared to be doing well. They're getting rave reviews. People were subscribing. I'd been working on a game called Bugtown since about 1988, 89, based on a line of comics that had gone through 2 publishers already. It was originally for people who delve back into the ancient history of role-playing game industry, Phage Press. Eric Wujik, who'd introduced me to Kevin Simbida, had published the first diceless role-playing game, Amber Diceless, and he was looking for a new title, and he signed up my Bugtown game. And we then spent 3 years, I think, working on it without actually writing a word of the game itself. We were still working on outlines after 3 years, and I was not getting paid a penny for all this work. At which point, Jonathan Tweed, best known for Ars Magica and Over the Edge, who had become head of role-playing at Wizards of the Coast, who were fat with Magic the Gathering money. This is 1994. Magic has exploded and transformed the games industry. Jonathan was became head of role-play, came to me and said, we would like to do Bugtown. So I took Bugtown away from Eric over to Jonathan. Wizards of the Coast then summarily shut down its role-playing department. So I had a role-playing game that I'd put almost 5 years work into and nothing to do. So I could publish this myself, but at the same time, I was very aware of the state of the British role-playing industry at the time, which was there was no British role-playing industry at the time. There'd been a number of companies that Games Workshop had pulled out in the late 80s. They had essentially pivoted over to being the Warhammer and 40K company, which in business terms was absolutely the right thing for them to do. At heart, I'm an old role player. Role playing is what I love. Games Workshop's business decision there ripped the heart out of role play. But at the same time, if they had continued being a role playing distributor, they would not be the multi-billion-dollar company they are today. It was absolutely the right move for them to make, and I will never criticize them for doing that. Pretty much, did very bad things to my hobby in this country. So a number of companies had tried to start up since Games Workshop, and they had pretty much all gone bust. And the reason is that the UK market simply wasn't large enough, and most of them had tried to focus on the UK market. I was very familiar with the American market. American distributors had already talked to them, and many of them or some of them, a few, 2, I think, were already handling interactive fantasy. So I knew how to talk to them. I knew how to get to them. So I went, what if we set up a British company that pretended to be an American company, that printed all its books in America, warehoused everything in America, shipped from America, because American distributors hate shipping from Europe, or at least they did in the 90s. Whereas European distributors, shipping from America is just something you do every week. The logistics are all in place. So be an American company, price everything in dollars, but based in the UK and actually a UK limited company. Would that work? And I ran some numbers and it seemed to. So, but the other thing I knew is if you start off with your own new game based on stuff that people don't know, that's a huge risk. What you need is a banker. You need something that's going to, basically create the cash flow that's going to make the rest of the company viable. So word reached me that the rights to Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay were available. And I knew there were a couple of other companies in the offing. Steve Jackson Games in the States were after it, and someone else, I can't remember who. But, I put together a bid, I put a proposal, spoke to Phil Gallagher, who was in charge of it at the time, in charge of licensing rather than roleplay. Roleplay at the time, nobody in Workshop was working on roleplay. As far as they were concerned, it was a dead IP for them. Put together this proposal, they came back and went, yeah, we like your bid. You can have it if you give us a lot of money. So I gave them a lot of money, and the rights to Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay were ours. And I have to admit, I was not a WFRP player. I had read it when it came out, not been madly impressed, because I'm a narrativist. I love the stuff that pushes the envelope, the stuff that goes ahead and breaks the mold. And WFRP hadn't done that when it came out. It was quite traditional. I mean, it's good role play, but it's quite traditional. So it was a business decision to take over to take on the license. At the same time, I knew I could do a good job with it. I knew I could tap into a pool of writers and artists, some of whom had worked on the original game, who would do a good job with it. I'd worked with Carl Sargent in the past. We'd written Sonic the Hedgehog novels together over for Virgin Publishing a couple of years previously. So I had ties into people who'd written for WFRP, all the old unpublished manuscripts. I got the Lustria manuscript very quickly. I got the Dave Morris and Jamie Thompson's Japan one. Is it Tetsubo?
The Nippon or the Tetsubo?
The Nippon.
Yeah.
Sure. Which is sort of WFRP-esque. It became fairly clear fairly early why these things had not been published. It's because not because they're bad necessarily, but they don't fit. They don't work with WFRP as it was in the 90s. But yeah, that was basically it. So signed this deal with Workshop, which as a creative was a fantastic deal. We got access to all the out of print stuff, the entire Games Workshop art archive. We could just, again, this is the mid 90s. Look at this stuff on the web. The answer to that was typically, well, what's the web? It was going up to Nottingham, literally paging through drawers of this artwork or very high resolution copies of it and going, yeah, we'd like to use that as a cover. And everyone just going, yeah, fine. So, fantastic art by some of Workshop's great artists, and just going, yeah, well, some John Blanche, some John Kirby, who did the covers of the Terry Pratchett books, cover on one of our books. I think we'll have some of that. Yeah, lovely fun, glory days. So that was it. So I recruited two friends, Andrew, the aforementioned Andrew Wilston, and Jane Mitten, who was ex-TSR, ex-Wizards of the Coast. And set up a company. And the next question is usually, why did you just reprint WFRP rather than do a second edition? And the answer is simply, we needed to get product on the market really fast in order to survive as a company. We needed to start creating cash flow and profit, because the company was self-financed. I didn't have investors. It came out of my savings, basically. So that was the intention there. You've acquired a companion.
I'm sorry, James. Yeah, my co-host, my familiar, has definitely decided to become involved. But no, I mean that sounds really amazing. Then, so you had this real treasure trove of content, and obviously were able to sort of look at what you were going to republish. I mean, how did you decide where to go first, like which products to bring back, whether to change things or continue working on certain products and just put some of that stuff back in the drawer, as it were, like you said?
Well, our priorities were the Enemy Within campaign, which is, even back then had the reputation of being one of the great campaigns. Get that back into print, not least because the scenario in the rulebook leads straight into it, which I think is it's a brilliant piece of design. I think WFRP was the first game to do that, to have the intro scenario lead into a published campaign directly, and a campaign of that stature as well. Had to have that in print. And then again, we wanted to do new material. So our first two books, I think, and it's a while since I've looked at our old publishing schedule, but we did Apocrypha Now, which was a collection of the best of the old White Dwarf articles and some of the stuff that had been in some of the supplements, like Restless Dead. And Restless Dead had always been essentially an anthology of, some new material, some I think reprints from White Dwarf, but stuff that had been around. So put the best of that back into print, because that was quite quick and comparatively cheap to do. And then we did, I'm blanking on the name of it, the scenario we did set in Marienburg, Dying of the Light.
Right.
Which was an anthology. Every chapter was written by a different author. So we came up with the overarching plot and the structure, and then we put out a call for authors and got some fantastic writers. Again, Phil Masters is in that, Chris Pramas, who went on to design the second edition, and a bunch of others. But, and then at that point, people will notice, the flow of scenarios and material kind of ebbed off pretty fast. And this was business reasons, basically. We had signed, stuff in America was going pretty well, but we had signed an exclusive deal with a distributor for the whole of Europe. And they had encouraged us to increase our print run quite dramatically. So we'd actually gone into it, we'd taken out a bank loan to finance the extended print run of the rulebook and the first couple of supplements. And it became clear that they were not going to pay us, that they just had no intention of doing that. I had not run a business before. I'd worked in publishing. I'd worked with publishers, but this was my first business. I could turn to American companies and say, well, what would you do in this situation? But there were no British companies that I could go to for advice. Didn't really know what to do, didn't handle it terribly well. And we basically ran out of money as a company. I had to make everyone, after about 3 months, I had to make everyone redundant, including myself. I took a day job and was then working evenings and weekends to get Hogshead back on a financially stable, even keel, which was a lot of work. And I was single at the time, which is probably a good thing. And yeah, it was a slog. It was a thoroughly unpleasant time. I'm still, my relationship with Jane and Andrew was irreparably damaged at that point. Don't hire your friends when you're setting up a company, because if it goes wrong, they will no longer be your friends. It's difficult. Having promised, I think we were saying four supplements a year, that suddenly became 1 or maybe 2. And the simple reason was, firstly, we had no money, and secondly, I didn't have as much time as I wanted to. And that was kind of the situation. The company continued that way until 1998, by which point we had paid off the overdraft. The company could afford to, we took an office, because previously it had been running in my spare bedroom, and hired Matthew Pook, who still works in the industry. And he came in 2 or 3 days a week, basically as my number 2, to handle a lot of the, basically some of the admin stuff, web stuff, because we had a website. 1998, finally we have a website. And not selling anything off the website. You could download a mail order form. That was about it. And things went, got better and better from there. The thing is, I wasn't earning a living from the company. Other people were, taking a decent salary, but because I owned the company, if the company was doing well, but I could get money from that. Although as the value of the company increased, but I didn't need that money because I was working a day job at the same time. There came a ridiculous situation in the early 2000s where I was running the largest role-play game company in the UK, and taking no money out of it because I was simultaneously working on the Sunday Times. It was quite a lot of pressure, as you can imagine.
The sales were strong, though, during that time, were they?
Yeah.
The distributor had asked for, would that have sold well, if not for the sort of distribution issues with that particular?
Yeah, I think we needed to reprint the rule. We printed, I can't remember the exact numbers, but our initial print was, I think we did 6,000 or 7,000 copies of the rule book, because it's Warhammer. We went over to the Gamma trade show. Gamma is the Games Manufacturers Association. It's an American company, American group, and they run an annual trade show called the Gamma Trade Show for the hobby games industry. And the year we went, it was in New Orleans. And you can get up, you have a trade stand, but there's also a breakfast presentation where companies can stand up. You pay for time to stand up and say, this is what we've got. And I did I think a 2-minute, 3-minute presentation, stood up and said, hi, we're Hogshead, we're a new British company. I could kind of feel people switching off and paying attention to their cooked breakfast and stuff. So what do we got? Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. And I got a round of applause, which was just, it's coming back. It's, and it was a top 10. For most of the time we were publishing it, it was one of the top 10 role-playing games in the English language. And there were, one of the interesting things about when we took it over, there were foreign editions. The French edition was still out there. The Polish edition, I think, had just gone out of print. There was a German edition and Italian, I think. Yes, definitely Italian. And these people were creating new material, though there were weird licensing things going on about, we never reprinted any of theirs. I'm not sure they ever printed any of ours. So there was an ecosystem there. But no, it was a successful game. That was the reason we took it on. The name Warhammer opens doors in the games industry generally. It's a guaranteed seller, because people will pick it up because it says Warhammer on the cover or on the spine. Whereas if I'd done Bugtown as our first major role-playing game, or Frup, which is my D&D parody that I still kick around and may publish at some point, though I don't call it Frup anymore. You see that on a shelf in a game store, which is the way that most people were exposed to new games at the time. I'm not sure Frup or Bugtown would have sold anything like the number of copies that Wolfrup would have done. But it was established wisdom that back in that kind of time, the mid-90s, as long as you knew more or less what you were doing, you could sell 2,000 copies of a new role-playing game. As long as you understood distribution, you could do some basic PR and marketing for it. 2,000 copies was a pretty standard print run. These days, no. No, the numbers, there was a continual decline. When Amber had come out in late 91, 92, I think the number had been 3,500, 4,000 copies of anything. By 95, it was 2,500. By 96, 97, it was, I think when we took over Slay Industries, we did possibly 2,500 copies of the rule book there. And that sold decently. But compare that to Wolfrup, whereas a Wolfrup supplement, the established wisdom, again, you would sell half as many supplements as you had of the rule book, or as you were selling of the rule book. If we published a Wolfrup supplement and we didn't sell 2,000 copies on the first day, something had gone badly wrong. So that's the level of being able to sell Wolfrup, a Warhammer role-playing game. It was a name that commanded some respect in the industry.
Yeah, and it's fascinating there. So, and I'm sure we'll come back to it, but it sort of sounds like both versions of the first edition of Wolfrup didn't necessarily come to an end as a result because of poor sales or because there wasn't a desire for more Wolfrup content. It was sort of external factors seem to have played a big role there. But you mentioned, so obviously you talked about the Dying Light and that's set in Marienburg. There's also the Marienburg supplement as well.
Anthony Reagan's brilliant source book. God, I love that book. Yeah. So glorious.
That was quite just what I don't know if you'll recall, but that sort of adapted and evolved from previous Marienburg content that was published in White Dwarf. I don't know if you've got any recollections about that process, because I'm building a Marienburg army at the moment, so it's quite a selfish question.
No, not at all. Anthony had written some of the White Dwarf material and had been involved with that, but the White Dwarf material only ever focused on one quarter of the city and was kind of building it up almost business by business, house by house, which for a city the size of Marienburg, we could have been there forever. But I knew Anthony because obviously he was very keen on the game. He used to work our booth at Gen Con, the big American trade show. And just as a volunteer, I'd get him a badge. So enormously grateful to him for that. And he was just a wildfire of good ideas about the game and the game world. So when he said, I'd like to do Marienburg, we basically went, yes, no question, you are the guy to do it. So he did. It took a while. It was in editing for a while. Again, I'm an editor, I'm a proofreader, I'm a layout designer. So pretty much all of that stuff would go through me. And I would be involved in that, but I was working a day job, or at one point 3 day jobs. It's overcommit me. So yeah, I was the bottleneck. I'm not a complete perfectionist, not to the extent that Eric Wojcik was, but I was not going to let out anything that I was not happy with in terms of its production quality. And this was a time when role-playing companies were routine, there was the joke of White Wolf doing Vampire and the World of Darkness stuff, and all their game, page references, see page XX, because they'd not bothered to do the final proof run on it and correct that stuff. And I was not going to have that happen to a game that had my company's name on it. So we set ourselves a high benchmark on that, but it did cause delays. I apologize to people who are, thrashing at the gate to get their hands on this stuff. And releasing the Enemy Within campaign very, very slowly and then not releasing the final volume. We could have handled that an awful lot better.
I mean, it sounds like a challenging time for you as a sort of business leader, and just generally as the industry was evolving and changing and shrinking from the sounds of things there. But you did release some other things, or some other products alongside WFRP during that time as well, didn't you? You mentioned Slay Industries. You also did Baron Munchausen. I mean, could you talk a little bit about those products and how you sort of came to be doing those?
And Slay I'd known the Nightfall Games guys since '94. They had been one of those British companies that had started up. They hadn't gone bust. They had been bought out by Wizards of the Coast to become Wizards of the Coast UK, because Wizards needed a distribution company to handle Magic in the UK. Fair enough. But what that had done is slam the brakes on Slay Industries. It's a very Glaswegian cyberpunk game. That's it's very violent. They're still using fax machines. It's very odd, but beautifully produced and had a fan base. And again, as with WFRP, it was not to my personal taste, but I knew there was a market for it, and there was, and they wanted to see new material. And I was a good mate of Tim Todopoulos, who was part of the Nightfall crew, lived close to me in London, actually came and worked out of our offices. We, at the time, in '98, we were sharing an office with Pro Fantasy Software, the sister company of Pelgrane Press. Pelgrane didn't become a role-playing company until the early 2000s, when they released the Dying Earth role-playing game based on the Jack Vance books. And they are now a good sized role playing company. But at the time, they were just doing map making software. They had a nice office in Clapham, literally walking distance from my house. I took some space in their office, and then Nightfall took some space as well. So it was the hub of the British role playing industry for a good year or so. So we took that on because, again, as with WFRP, there was an existing rule book that we could reprint, and we knew there was a demand for it. And they had new supplements ready to go. So we started off doing some short stuff with them. Didn't sell colossally. It wasn't WFRP numbers by any means, but it did comfortably. Baron Munchausen, for those who don't know it, was a vanity project. This, because I had set up Hogshead, among other things, to publish games with my name on them that I had designed. And we'd got to 1998, and nothing we had designed had my name on it. And yes, I'd edited a couple of the WFRP books, but that's not the same. I just went, well, I've got this little idea for a thing, and I can do it like it was a fanzine. I can do it as a kind of a fire and forget project. Hold on a moment. I'm going to get it. I'll show you it. Right, well, that's not actually the copies. Okay, so these are the Italian and the Spanish editions. But right. You can see that is not a big book. It's 24 pages. And it's all copyright-free artwork. It's Gustave Doré, the 19th century French artist, all completely out of copyright. So, I mean, Baron Munchausen's rules are basically half a page. And I had the idea, I won't go into the development process, but it literally came to me in a flash. This game, it's like, you can't sell half a page of rules. So I dressed it up with 23 and a half pages of padding. Basically, it's fluff, it's color text, but it adds to the milieu and the sense of the environment and everything. Threw it out at Gen Con 98. I think our advanced distributor orders were 200 copies. And I expected this thing to crash and burn, and I didn't care, because it was finally a game that I had designed for my company, and I'd done it. And if it found 200 people who were interested, I was happy. What it found was Ken Hite. I don't know if you know Ken and Ken's work.
I don't know.
He's been a role-playing commentator and writer for a very long time. He designed Nephilim for Chaosium. He does a huge amount of work for Pelgrane Press. He is genuinely brilliant, but at the same time, a lot of work for Steve Jackson as well. But had a column, I can't remember who he was writing for, basically where he talked about new RPG releases. He got hold of a copy of Munchausen and basically spent Gen Con 98 going around going, have you seen this? You need a copy of this. And he kind of became its St. Paul. He went out and spread the word of, you must buy a copy of Baron Munchausen. We sold out at Gen Con. And at that point, the distributor orders started coming in for it. And it's, you know, on its third edition now. It continues to develop and evolve. There's stuff happening with it that I can't talk about. What I thought was a fire and forget vanity project has become, and this is the interesting thing, because a lot of people have never heard of it, but if you ask the question, what is the first published role-playing game that breaks away from the Gygax-Arneson paradigm of GM and players, dice, multiple session campaigns, experience points, character sheets, all the rest of that? It's this. This is a single session multiplayer. You are playing roles, you're telling stories in character, challenging each other. It plays in about 45 minutes. That's it. And people go, but it's not really a game. There's a winner. It's more of a game than Dungeons and Dragons is, or WFRP. So yeah, it was the thing that broke the mold. It was the thing that basically ushered in the story game revolution. And having been a success, we then started a line of similar titles, which we called New Style. Robin Laws did one for us. We did John Tynes of Pagan Publishing's Puppet Land, which is a conventional role-playing. It's a GM and players game, but you play it in hour-long sessions, and you all play puppets in a world of puppets, but it's a nasty world of puppets. Absolutely brilliant. Oh my God, the atmosphere and the richness of that. It's so clever. Robin Laws did us a thing called Pantheon and Other Role-Playing Games, which is 5 role-playing games in this 24-page book. What else? I'm forgetting one. Oh, Greg Costikyan. Greg is the guy who did Paranoia for West End Games, designed the first Star Wars role-playing game, one of the greater gods of role-play in the 80s. He does a game called Violence, a role-playing game of egregious and repulsive bloodshed, which he'd actually pitched to me 2 or 3 years previously. He said it's one of those games where you storm down a corridor, kick down the first door you come to, kill everything on the other side, take anything you can sell, off down the corridor, next door, kick it in, and it's set in modern day New York. And I laughed so hard that cider came out of my nose. But at the time, I had no way of publishing it because do a kind of little satirical thing like that. There is no market, or there wasn't a market for that. But we did it as a new style game, and it was, we sold 3,000 copies or so, and it's great. Clint Langley artwork. The book is a thing of beauty. I did not realize that the Hogshead office scanner was breaking down at the time. So as I was scanning Clint's art, because it's pre-digital art, it's the late 90s. People forget how pre-digital an awful. I mean, we did obviously all our layout and all. Everybody had a computer in the office, but a lot of stuff was still created in analog form. So yeah, the scanner was breaking down. So the art is grungier and grayer than Clint's art normally is. And it's visceral. It's a visceral role-playing game. And then the final new style that we did, which is another completely groundbreaking thing, is a brilliant Polish game called De Profundis, which is the first journaling and epistolatory role-playing game, where you play Lovecraft investigators and you literally physically write and send letters to each other, going, I have discovered a hint that there may be something mysterious going on in the woods outside the village where I live. And the person across would go, that's very curious, because the symbol that you describe matches up with a symbol I found on an archaic altar, and so on. And you create this world together until one of you writes the letter that goes, tonight is the night I will go and confront this group. And then you never write another letter. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Contains rules for solo play. It's just a work of plus the entire book is its own example of play, because the entire rule book is a series of letters to an unknown correspondent. It's wonderful. I'm so proud of that. So proud we published that. It's brilliant. So we did that, and that was making a few waves. And I think I'm not going to claim responsibility for The Forge, which was the online group that basically created the story game revolution in the early 2000s. But I think we were certainly one of the things that helped set light to that bonfire that was ready to go. So there was that. But yeah, I mean, the WFRP was still selling really well, but you have to remember what else was going on. Dungeons and Dragons 3rd edition was just coming out, was about to come out. And one of the reasons that role-playing sales had dropped off over the course of the 90s is because there was no Dungeons and Dragons. Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, yes, you could buy, but if you've got a 14-year-old who goes, oh, I've heard about Dungeons and Dragons, are you going to buy? You can't find Dungeons and Dragons. All you can find is Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Nobody starts playing a game with the advanced version. So sales had dropped off. And of course, TSR, who were in, as is well known now, were in massive financial trouble, could not keep product in print. There was no reliable distribution. So role-playing as a kind of a market force, particularly outside of the hobby games industry, was dying away. And the shape of the role-playing industry is essentially there's Dungeons and Dragons, here's everyone else. We are Call of Cthulhu, possibly, and then everyone else. We are appendices to an appendix to the games industry. Role-playing is not a big sector by any means. And when your flagship product is not available, it affects everybody else's sales. And that happened. But then D&D came back, and there was much rejoicing, and sales were picking up universally, and people were talking about it again. And then there was the open gaming license, which a stroke of genius, absolutely brilliant. Ryan Dancy, an amazing thing to do, to basically go, yeah, you can use our IP. But it became very clear very quickly that a huge amount of crap was coming onto the market, and because D&D is such a market force, distributors were picking that stuff up in preference to other role-playing games. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay still has the word Warhammer on the cover. It's still doing well. It's still got its place within the ecosystem. But new role-playing games that were not based on the open gaming license or the D20 license were not doing terribly well. So that's the early 2000s. I'm getting ahead of myself, but that is ultimately one of the reasons why I shuttered the company in late 2002. Actually sold it in 2003. But by that point, we'd handed back all the license. What I sold was the company, but none of the games. All the games had gone back to their owners. Because the market was full of crap, basically. So distributors bought into this stuff and then couldn't sell it because a lot of it was crap. Their cash flow was all tied up in this product that wasn't moving. A number of distributors went down, a number of publishers went down. It was a hard time for the industry. And the obvious thing for Hogshead to have done at that point was to jump on that D20 bandwagon, but that's not what I'm interested in. That's not the sort of games that I wanted to publish. I knew there was, as with interactive fantasy, I knew there was a market and an interest in the other stuff, the new exciting stuff, but there still wasn't a route to get to that market. So I decided, plus I'd been working incredibly hard for 7 or 8 years. I'd been through a tricky divorce. I'd been through, not due to Hogshead, not due to my workload, due to me. Let's not go into that. But yeah, I burnt out basically. But it looked like the industry was not going anywhere interesting for a while. So I just decided to take a back seat. So I did that. I was still running the Diana Jones Award, which I'd set up in 2000 at that point. And our final farewells were, we did Nobilis in 2001, I think, the Great White Book. Do you know it?
I'm familiar with it by name. I've never actually read it or played it.
Again, hold on one second. This is Nobilis. It's a coffee table role-playing game and was designed as such because a lot of, I've trained as a graphic designer, among other things. A lot of the graphic design on a lot of role-playing games is really quite adolescent. It's quite image heavy. It's just, it doesn't look kind of mature. And so instead I wanted something with beautiful, clean design and some really, really great artwork. That's Fraser Irving, the comics artist who'd done some work for us before. It's all set in Adobe Caslon. It's the only font that we use. Actually, there's a couple of tables that are in something else, but it's really clean. All the art is full page art. That's Raven Mimura. That's bizarre. That's Martin McKenna, That's a piece by Martin McKenna, who was experimenting with doing photo manipulation at the time. Was not what I expected from him. Who else have we got here? Rick Martin, who did a lot of stuff for Warpstone. Great artist. No idea what's happened to Rick. Lovely chap. That's Denise Garner, that kind of stuff. So we wanted to do something that didn't feel like a traditional role-playing game at all. And it's got this beautiful binding. It's got a bookmark. There's a spot varnish on the cover. This is actually a 19th century Art Deco sculpture by Charles van der Stappen. And it was an experiment. I mean, it was a really expensive experiment. The book retailed, I think, for $42, which at the time, I believe, was the first role-playing game to break the $40 mark, which was the kind of, oh, you can't sell a role-playing game for more than $40. Well, we gave it a shot, and we sold 3,000 copies in 6 months, which, you know, for the early 2000s, that was pretty good. And we did one supplement for it, and at that point, it was clear that the industry was not going anywhere good. So I handed over the rights to Guardians of Order, who did literally nothing with it, and then went messily bankrupt. But by that point, I was out of the industry.
So because it was about 2002, you said that Hogshead came to a close, and you mentioned there that you sort of handed back all the rights to all of those different licenses, all those games. Was there ever a time where you considered selling Hogshead and all of its licenses as an ongoing concern?
I talked to Games Workshop about possibly doing that, because obviously if I'd been able to, if WFRP had been part of the package, there would have been companies who were very interested in buying it. And I did. Gen Con 2002, I had discussions with a number of companies about possibly taking over Hogshead. But Games Workshop were not willing to let me transfer the license like that. There was a clause in the contract that said this license is not transferable. I talked to them and said, well, you know, could we transfer it? And they were like, no. I also had hints from Workshop that, you know, we paid our royalties on the nail, but I think they felt they could have done better. They were looking for a company that was going to do a second edition. And I couldn't tell you why we had long discussions about doing a second edition, but we never took the jump. We never genuinely started work on one. I don't know why. We probably should have. I mean, first edition was still selling perfectly well at the kind of volumes that it had done when we took it over. So there was a sense of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The other reason was we really wanted to publish Realms of Sorcery before we, you know, did a second edition. And Realms of Sorcery was a troubled book. Obviously, you had to fit into what was going to be a good role-playing supplement, but also had to fit in with the current version of the Warhammer world. And we had a couple of things that we kind of ad hoc rules that I'm not sure we ever made absolutely clear. The way we put it to our writers was our version of the Warhammer world is 5 years before the one in the battle game. So we've got a certain amount of leeway, and we can make changes, which, you know, the book I never wrote, Empire in Flames, which was Empire in Chaos, which was going to be my rewrite of Empire in Flames, which I had plotted out and outlined, and then I was working for, who was I working for at the time? For 3Com, having left the Sunday Times and all the rest of, hang on, what's the time scale on that? No, hadn't worked on the Sunday. Yeah. Okay. So early 2001, worked for 3Com. .com bubble bursts. They closed the entire division. The division, this was 3Com's Internet Appliance division. This sounds like a digression. I was working for Ray Winninger, who went on to become head of D&D for Wizards of the Coast for D&D 5. Ray is an old friend and he's brilliant. A brilliant creator, but brilliant business strategist as well. So, and when Ray Winninger says, hey, come and work for me at 3Com, I've got some interesting products, you go. So I'd done that, but I had a long commute. I'd done all the outlining on my work laptop. Job came to an end. Zipped up all my files into a zip file, emailed it to myself, handed back the laptop, went home, opened the zip file, and it was corrupt. And when a zip file is corrupt, there is nothing you can do. There is no way back. That data is gone. I lost an entire small role-playing game I had written called Afterlives, and all my notes for Empire and Chaos, which is why that never came out. I had a point to this. I wanted to do, the hope was that we'd do Empire and Chaos, we'd do Realms of Sorcery as well, and then notionally might do a second edition. But as I say, the industry was turning against it. I got the sense that Games Workshop was looking for another licensee, because they felt that they could do better with the IP. So times have changed. Games Workshop by this point had the Black Library. They were more role-playing friendly. They were more stuff that isn't just Warhammer games friendly. And the Black Library would have been a perfect home for it. So also Mark Gascoigne, who set up and ran the Black Library, was one of the people I had written Sonic the Hedgehog novels with back in the day. Mark and I've known Mark since the 80s. We are old mates. We would talk on a regular basis. And, so stick a finger in the air, working out which way the wind's blowing. Better to hand back the license than to have it summarily taken away after you've invested thousands of pounds in writing an artwork and layout for a book that's never going to come out.
Sure, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, there were a couple of other books as well as the Empire and Chaos, like the Realms of Divine Magic, which was another long, previously announced book, and you mentioned Lustria as well, which I think Richard Halliwell originally looked at. I mean, how close did they get to any sort of real release?
We were not actively working on those. I'd made approaches to Games Workshop about doing Lustria. We had a couple of really interesting ideas for. I mean, I'd love to have done Lustria as a continent, but I also had an idea for a really interesting adventure set in Lustria in a way that would not have impinged on would not have set in stone anything about Lustria in the Warhammer world. Because at the time, I don't think there was anything official about Lustria. And Workshop is at the time was very reticent about other companies creating new background for Warhammer or for 40k. So we had ideas for that. Realms of Divine Magic never really got anywhere. And Realms of Sorcery was such a slog to get out. It was kind of, we would have done second edition before we did Divine Magic. The book that I really wanted to do, we had a complete manuscript and Workshop turned down, was Skaven. We had a Skaven source book by a couple of great Australian writers. I really liked it, and it didn't happen. And that's the one I regret. And the one, I think the one I'm quite pleased with, it was Fear the Worst. I don't know if you've seen Fear the Worst. It was the very last thing we did for WFRP. And we pitched this to Workshop as what happens if we do a WFRP scenario, but we put D20 stats in there. And they were like, I'm not sure about that at all. And that was the genesis of the idea. But what actually happened is we got Mike Merles, who later on became, one of the chief architects of Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, to write this. It's a silly adventure. It's a silly little WFRP adventure. But we gave it away. It was the last thing Hogshead published. It was a free download. I think it's about 30 pages or so, solid stuff, still floating around somewhere on the net. And it was a thank you for 8 or 9 good years of, and the fan support of our line. Here's a freebie. We're off. And I'm really pleased we were able to do that.
I mean, that sounds. I'm not familiar with Fear the Worst, so I definitely will check that out. But the Skaven book as well sounds like, a real missed opportunity. I'm a big fan of Skaven as well. So
I love the Skaven. Yeah, I mean, one of the really interesting. So much of WFRP is kind of, it's obviously it's D&D or traditional fantasy tweaked a bit, but the Skaven are so much of the Warhammer world, so much at the essence, it's the rot at the center of it. Brilliant. I love the Skaven. Skaven and Chaos generally are what make the things that make Warhammer really interesting for me. The elves and dwarves, you can get elves and dwarves anywhere, but Skaven, proper Skaven, not just the rat people. No, go away. They're Skaven. Yeah.
Did you get any sense of why Games Workshop were not keen on publishing it?
I don't. I mean, to be honest, I don't remember. There was quite a lot of correspondence at the time. I mean, the other thing we were pitching, this would have been a giant leap. Ian Sturrock, who at the time was our sales and marketing guy, now Dr. Ian Sturrock, and a role-playing academic, talking about things coming around in a circle. Big LARPer, and he wrote or outlined in considerable depth a Woofrup LARP system. And we pitched this to Workshop, and Workshop we really have no idea what to do with this. And I knew it was a long shot, because the idea of, for a game whose cover has a dwarf in a mohawk, disemboweling an orc, basically, to have a LARP system, that's kind of dangerous to start with. But it could have been so much. Ian is a great game designer. He left us and went over to Mongoose and did some really, really interesting stuff for Mongoose. Again, that would have been so much fun to do. Never happened. He may still have the rules kicking around somewhere if you can get in touch with him.
Well, you mentioned there about the sort of broader industry changes and D20 coming in and all that sort of stuff, and that the sort of way in which things were shifting. Obviously, as you say, you'd done the sort of new style games and tried to move more to a story-led version of role-playing. But around that time, when you closed down Hogshead, you gave an interview where you did talk about the sort of sense or the feel that you had that many developers of role-playing games might just be sort of recreating D&D and not even realizing that that's what they were doing.
Yeah.
I mean, do you still feel that way about the industry? Do you think the industry's moved on since that time, or have we evolved and changed, or is it still in that same kind of place?
It's really interesting. I mean, there are bits of the industry that you look at role-playing games on itch, there are people doing 1 page, half page. The thing came through, I saw on Blue Sky today, someone advertising I think it was a 23-word role-playing game. I'm impressed, I have to say. And at the same time, you've got the OSR, which is literally, as far as I'm concerned, trying to recreate a better Dungeons and Dragons is like trying to invent the perfect Ford Granada. I'm sure it's possible. Why are you bothering? There are so many better cars. There are so many more enjoyable cars to drive than a Ford Granada. I don't care if your first blowjob was in the back seat of a Ford Granada in 1976. Stop it. But yeah, people are literally reinventing Dungeons and Dragons these days. The OSR didn't exist 20 years ago, but there was very much that sense that people were trying to recreate that simple, its numbers go up catharsis. That's the stuff that drives D&D and D&D clones. And yes, you can put in more narrative stuff. And it would be another 10 years before Powered by the Apocalypse, which is the bit that says, take the power from the GM, give it to the players. That is the genius of Powered by the Apocalypse. Yeah, I didn't know exactly what I wanted to come out of roleplay. I've never had this grand plan for where I want the industry to go. And like I said, I thought Munchausen was a fire and forget vanity project. I did not realize it would be the harbinger of a revolution. But yeah, the stuff I will champion is the stuff that pushes boundaries and goes, what if we did it differently? What if we optimize this dice mechanic? Or what if D8s instead of D6s? No, go away. Stop it. Think bigger. Really, what if no GM? What if everybody was I have a draft, 1,000-word draft of a thing where everybody is the GM except for one player at a time. And I think it would probably work. I've not actually tested it. My curse is I have what my best man at my first wedding described as idea diarrhea. I have probably 2 ideas for new role-playing games a day. And the problem is working out which one of those is worth pursuing, if any. The thing that's got my attention at the moment, I'm designing a thing called Cyberplunk, which is a cyberpunk role-playing game using Kerplunk as the mechanic. I'm serious. I'm doing this. Right. It's not going to be big. This is not, we're not talking about a chunky rule book. This will be 6 pages. But I think it's doable. And it started off as a parody of Dread, which is the horror role-playing game that uses Jenga as its core mechanic. It is brilliant. If you've not read Dread, you should read Dread. It's an absolute genius. And the idea started as a parody of that. And then I went, oh no, actually this works, because what if different colored beads and different colored, and I've got an actual game here. And it's trying to find the time to actually write it down, knowing that it will make, nobody will pay for it. Money in this stuff.
I mean, that sounds quite exciting, though. Yeah, I'd love to see what that looks like when it comes. But
I'll send you a copy.
So you'd left behind Hogshead, you'd left behind WFRP, but you weren't quite done with Warhammer and the fantasy world. You came back and wrote a couple of novels as well for it, didn't you?
I did, yeah. I mean, I'd written short fiction for Inferno, which was the first thing that the Black Library put out was a monthly magazine called Inferno, which was a combination of short fiction and comic strips. And it's where Dan Abnett did his first Warhammer work and a bunch of others. Gav Thorpe came up out of there. I think Chris Pramas had some stories in it. Some great stuff. And I had huge fun writing 4 stories, I think, for that. And then I put Hogshead to one side, but I'm still fundamentally a writer. And I came up with an idea for a novel, pitched it to Mark. Mark was, yeah, all right, do that. So I wrote it, and while I was writing it, or I think it had just come out, they said they were planning, I forget the name of the thing. It was the big chaos incursion into the Warhammer world. Storm of Chaos resulted in the destruction of Middenheim. And they said, will you do 3 more books, all around, the events leading up to the Storm of Chaos and after the destruction of Middenheim? And I went, well, I'm not sure this character's really got that in them, and it was conceived as a one-off, but all right, I'll give it a try. So I wrote a second one, and it wasn't great. I mean, I think the story is great, but the writing experience was kind of horrible. And for all kinds of reasons, partly to do with me, partly to do with my editor at Games Workshop, who, when you get notes going, this character who keeps popping up and being enigmatic, who are they? They're the bad guy. Will you go and read the outline again? Honestly. And also the money was, for a 80,000, 100,000 word book, the money was awful. So I wrote one of them and discovered that Games Workshop the Black Library had announced the release date for the book after that one. And it was like, we don't even have a contract for this. Let alone discussing the outline and the plot. I'm done. I'm out. And I went off and publicized movies for a while. I worked on movie trailers and TV ads and radio ads and stuff, which was just, one of those, the job comes up and you go, that'll be fun. Not done that. See what it's like. Had a hoot, worked on Shaun of the Dead. Got to recording trailers with or radio ads with Peter Seranovich. Man, he's a genius. I mean, worked with a lot of good people, but Seranovich, oh my lord. Anyway, sorry, I'm digressing.
That's good stuff. So, and then you recently moved into writing again you talked about the sort of meta and the industry and being interested in that from an academic perspective. You wrote a book, Everybody Wins, 4 decades of the greatest board games ever made. Yeah. Looking back at the industry and the sort of tabletop world, what was the sort of process behind that?
Well, it started off as a magazine column. I did a column for Tabletop Gaming magazine about the Spiel des Jahres, which is the German Game of the Year award, which has been running since 1979. And it's the Oscars of games, basically, or almost. That's not a bad way of describing it, except they give one. These days it's 3 prizes. Initially it was just one, rather than best card game, best family card game, best strategy card game. No, don't. If you're setting up an award, don't do that. You're diluting your brand. So the Spiel des Jahres goes to one game, and it is the German Game of the Year, and it's an award with enormous financial clout. It's past its peak, but it used to be if you won the Spiel, you'd probably sell an extra 50,000, 500,000 copies of your game, 500,000 copies of your game.
Wow.
Which is huge. I mean, that's bigger than the Booker Prize's impact in terms of sales. So some of these games have gone on to be Stone Classics. Catan won, Carcassonne won, Ticket to Ride won. And then there's a bunch of others that have just faded into complete obscurity, like Alf Axe, or the second British game to win, Railway Rivals, which Games Workshop scholars will remember was a Games Workshop title in the early 80s, 84. That was the last English edition of Railway Rivals. Games Workshop published it. It won the Spiel des Jahres. It went out of print and has stayed out of print ever since. Why? And it's, you know, it's an opportunity to look into that and just look at where the games industry has come from over the last 40 years or so. And it's a really fun book. And again, they've done it as it's Aconite, which is Asmodee's book publishing arm, run again by Mark Gascoigne. Mark's and mine's careers tightly interwoven. So Mark was my publisher on that. And it's a beautiful book. It's done really well. But before that, I did a book with Ian Livingston on the history of games as a form, generally, called Board Games in 100 Moves. Awful title. Not our. Both Ian and I hate the title. It was imposed on us by the publisher. But that, you know, that's, if you're interested in the, you know, the prehistoric origins of games and ancient Roman games, there's a lot of stuff in the fun book. Huge fun working with Ian on that, and just getting access to Ian's games collection, which is, he has a, as you can imagine, Ian Livingston's house is not small, and he has a not small room that is just games, just board games and role-playing games, and many copies of the Fighting Fantasy books in all the languages, and not one but two full-scale fiberglass Lara Crofts. Because if you don't know, what Ian Livingston did after Games Workshop was he basically went off and ran Eidos, the company that produced Lara Croft. He's the godfather of Lara Croft, Tomb Raider. Yeah, he's an extraordinary man. Ian is a hoot. Any time spent with Ian is always a delight. So yeah, I've done that. I seem to have become a games historian by accident. I was never really intending to. But so I'm doing a lot of that stuff, and then I'm looking at writing more games, more books about games at the moment. And I have a secret project that I can't talk about for 2024, but is again, it's the meta. It's looking at the games industry, the games ecosystem as a whole, and look at where are the problems with this ecosystem? What can we do to fix that? And I think I've spotted a big hole and a way of patching it that might actually make some money, which, you know, is far from a guarantee in the games industry, but who knows?
Sure. I mean, and thinking about the games industry and sort of how things work, you also co-host a podcast, Ludonarrative Distance, right? Where you look at different RPGs and how they were developed. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's myself and two other games designers, Ross Payton, who does a thing called Role Playing Public Radio, and Greg Stolze, who's best known for his work on Vampire and Delta Green and his own game Unknown Armies. And it came about, somebody on Twitter, back when we went on Twitter, was kicking, I think Monty Cook put out a call for people to work on the Old Gods of Appalachia role-playing game based on the successful podcast of the same name. And somebody went, what about Greg Stolze? What about James Wallis? And we both kind of went, we don't know the materia, and neither of us are Appalachian and have any kind of sympathy with, you know, it's not our vibe. It's not what we do well. And someone just tweeted, man, but a podcast with James Wallis and Greg Stolze, that'd be a thing, wouldn't it? And so I kind of virtually caught Greg's eye across the internet, and Greg caught mine. And he was like, well, neither of us really know podcasts. We know someone else, but I know Russ. So he went and got Ross, and, you know, Luda, this thing evolved out of it. And yeah, each episode we take one role-playing game or one role-playing mechanic, and we basically vivisect it. We take it apart to see how it works, where it evolved from, what are the implications of using it within your game, how does this particular game work, all the rest of that. And then we rebuild it and talk about how people use this, how people play that game in particular. We're about to kickstart the third season. in which we'll also be looking at role-playing campaigns. There's a good chance we'll be looking at the enemy within, or at least parts of the enemy within. Obviously, because we try and play the games before we talk about them. Not always possible. But if you're talking about a role-playing campaign, you can't play test an entire campaign before doing one episode of a podcast on it. But we may well, I'm going to push very hard to look at Power Behind the Throne, which I believe remains, however many years on we are, 40 years on, more than 40, yeah, coming up on 40 years on for the Power Behind the Throne, surely. One of the most brilliantly written and brilliantly structured role-playing adventures of all time. It is a masterpiece. My admiration for Carl's construction on that is second to none.
I mean, that sounds like that's going to be quite an episode. You almost promised it now, James. So you're going to have to cover it in some form.
Well, the thing is that what we do is decided by, if you back the Kickstarter, you get a vote on what we cover. So it's not all down to us, but we're introducing a thing where we will start putting in the games that we want to talk about. But we do try and do stuff that people can actually get hold of, rather than, I mean, if it was down to me, episode 1 would be Empire of the Petal Throne, episode 2 would be the Ghostbusters role-playing game, neither of which can be had for love nor money these days, but both of which are fascinating pieces of design. But no, we try and talk about stuff that that people have actually heard of or possibly played. Though that was one, because again, as part of the Kickstarter, if you back at a sufficient level, you personally, individually get to choose a game that we do an episode on. And somebody chose a game called Outlaws of the Water Margin, which you have never heard of. I'd say with some certainty.
Oh, I haven't. Well,
it's unpublished. It's a fan game that kind of snuck out on the net. And Russ and Greg were saying, I've never heard of this, never even come across it. And I was going, well, if you look on page 3, you'll see I have a playtester credited with it. Because it was created by Paul Mason, who I role-played with in the late 80s. Paul, ex-Games Workshop, ex-co-editor, assistant editor on White Dwarf. I believe, I could be wrong on this, but if the infamous Sod Off Brian Ansell, you know the Sod Off Brian Ansell
sure, yeah.
Issue of White Dwarf magazine, I think Ian Marsh and Paul Mason. Ian Marsh was editing at the time and Paul was assistant or deputy editor, and I was in their role-playing group. So, yeah, and Paul was, I mean, again, a lot of my early role-playing design decisions and stuff was very, very influenced by Paul, who really pushed, what can we do with this thing? Does it just have to be levels and character classes and hit points and stuff? Let's take it beyond that. Let's do more. And Outlaws of the Water Margin was his big game. And we did, at Hogshead, we looked at publishing it. But the problem was I did a scan of his current version of the manuscript and went, we would need to make the following changes to make this a commercially releasable game. And Paul was, no, you publish it as is or not at all. And in that case, I'm sorry, I'm running a commercial company. It has to be not at all. We had a number of run-ins. Paul was, that was Paul's pet project, and fair enough. But we had a couple of things with writers who we had to say goodbye to. One of the stories, I wasn't originally going to write Empire in Chaos. Originally, we knew it needed to be rewritten because it was Empire in Flames. The original ending was a very unsatisfactory ending to this epic campaign. And a writer was recommended to me. I completely forget his name, so I'm not going to embarrass him. He put together a really good proposal. We thrashed it around. We worked out a really great structure for it. Had a sit-down meeting, him and me and Andy Jones, who was running Games Workshop. I think was running Games Workshop licensing at the time. And Andy goes, yeah, we really like this. We understand the need to rewrite this volume. However, due to forthcoming changes and stuff that we're publishing for Warhammer, we're going to need the following changes. And the author goes, well, I've put a lot of work into this proposal and I don't see why I should change anything further now. And I looked at Andy and said, well, I'm sorry for wasting your time with this guy who doesn't get it. And that was my last dealings with him. And again, this is the realities of running a publishing business. You've got your big master up here, and what Games Workshop says goes. There's no way we could have done stuff that was not going to fit in with Warhammer. At the same time, you have people who want to do interesting creative work, bringing their vision to it. You have to find that middle path, and you have to tread it all the time. And when you hit a hiccup like that, that's a 6-month delay. A book that you'd penciled in for a 2001 release is now back a year to 2002, potentially. Or you start the hunt for another writer, or eventually go, oh, sod it, I'll write it myself. I've got some ideas.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. And then, so that Ludonarrative Dissodents, is that going on Kickstarter soon then for the next season 3?
I think February, March we'll be right. Kickstarting that. Yeah, it's. I mean, if you want to find it, ludonarrativedissonance.com, not dissonant. It's a pun on ludonarrative dissonance, which is a term from games criticism. We are the Ludonarrative Dissidents. .com, all wherever you get your podcasts, we are there, and we have our own website as well. And
I will put the link to the website in the description below. But now, James, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me.
This has been a pleasure, being able to get so much stuff off my back. It's. I mean, the fundamental thing is, yes, we took a bunch of flack for not doing the creative stuff that a lot of people wanted from WFRP, but we were beholden to the bank manager and Games Workshop themselves. But if Hogshead has any kind of legacy, I think the fact that we were able to prove it is possible to run a British role-playing company and make it work financially, because the companies that then succeeded in the late 90s and early 2000s were following our business model. They were printing everything in America, they were warehousing in America, and they were behaving like that. Plus the fact that we had existed and had not gone bust, and had, that meant that American distributors in particular were willing to take a gamble on other British companies. So just proving that was doable, I think, if we did nothing else, was worth doing. For the state of the British industry. If there's a footnote to it, the epilogue to the history of Hogshead, which don't write a history of Hogshead, it's really not worth it. Plus, I'm getting old. My memory is I've forgotten half of the things that happened.
Well, everything that you talked about today was just really super interesting. So yeah, once again, thank you very much.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Really great to chat.
I would like to extend thanks to James for talking through some of his incredible experiences in the RPG world. An absolutely incredible story, one of a kind, and it was fascinating to hear just a fraction of that stuff. I would love to hear more in the future too. If you want to support the work I do here on the channel, then you can check out my Patreon, my Ko-fi, and my Discord. And I've also now got affiliate links for Element Games, so when you go and buy all of your hobby needs, you can support me as well. Links to all of those are in the description below. Thank you once again to James. Thank you for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.